In 1957, two MIT engineers stepped into a weathered 19th century textile mill overlooking the Assabet River in Maynard, Massachusetts, and leased 8,680 square feet of empty factory space for just $300 a month. Decades earlier, the same mill had produced blankets for Union troops during the Civil War. By then, its halls were filled with dust, the scent of aging wood, and the echoes of a forgotten industry. Ken Olson and Harlan Anderson outfitted their small workspace with office furniture purchased on credit from a nearby retailer. Armed with just $70,000 in startup funding, they believed the computer industry was heading in the wrong direction, and they even avoided using the word computer in their company's name because their primary investor thought the term would scare people away. 3 decades later, the business born inside that old mill had grown into a global powerhouse. It employed more than 120,000 people in over 80 countries, generated roughly $14 billion in annual revenue, and ranked second only to IBM in the worldwide computer market. Fortune magazine even named Ken Olson the most successful entrepreneur in America. But the rise didn't last. In 1998, what remained of Digital Equipment Corporation was acquired by Compaq for $9.6 billion, less than half of the company's peak valuation. Just 4 years later, Compaq itself was absorbed by Hewlett-Packard. The old mill in Maynard is still there, its clock tower still marking the hours. But the name that once defined an era has long since disappeared from its walls. The story of how a company that once challenged IBM on its own turf and eventually lost everything begins with a young boy repairing radios in the basement of his family's home in Connecticut. You're watching History of American Electronics, where we uncovered the stories of the companies that built the modern electronics industry, following the engineers, inventions, and breakthroughs that changed the world one circuit board at a time. If you enjoy learning how the machines that made computing accessible were created long before the personal computer revolution, be sure to subscribe, because this company's remarkable rise is every bit as fascinating as the collapse that followed. Now, let's go back to Maynard. Kenneth Harry Olson was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1926 into a family of Norwegian and Swedish heritage. His father worked as a machine tool designer, exposing him to engineering from an early age. As a boy, Olson spent countless hours in the family's basement, repairing broken radios for neighbors, earning a reputation around town as the kid who could bring dead electronics back to life. After serving in the United States Navy from 1944 to 1946, he enrolled at MIT. There, he completed a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering in 1950, followed by a master's degree in the same field 2 years later. While working at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory, Olson contributed to the SAGE air defense system, the Cold War network built to detect and track Soviet bombers in real time. But it was a much smaller project that changed the way he thought about computers. The laboratory housed an experimental machine known as the TX-0, a compact computer stripped down for research. Olson noticed something that the people approving the budgets had completely overlooked. Students were willing to wait for hours just to use the TX-0, even though a far more powerful IBM computer sat in the same building. They walked right past the larger machine without giving it a second thought. The difference wasn't raw processing power, it was the experience. The TX-0 allowed users to sit at a keyboard and interact with the computer in real time. IBM's systems, by contrast, required programmers to submit stacks of punch cards and wait until the next day for the results. That contrast convinced Olson that the future of computing wasn't simply building faster machines, it was making them interactive. His colleague Harlan Anderson shared the same vision. At the time, computers were enormous systems that cost millions of dollars and operated behind glass walls in carefully climate-controlled rooms. Olson and Anderson imagined something entirely different, a computer compact and affordable enough for a single laboratory, a manufacturing plant, or even a hospital department. What they needed most was funding. In the late 1950s, few American investors had any interest in financing computer startups. The industry was viewed as too risky, too expensive, and already controlled by established companies. Then they found someone willing to take the gamble. Georges Doriot, the French-born Harvard Business School professor who headed American Research and Development Corporation, one of the nation's first venture capital firms, invested $70,000 in return for a 70% ownership stake. Doriot also helped shape the company's identity. He suggested the name Digital Equipment Corporation after a recent Fortune magazine article pointed out that almost no one was making money in the computer business. In his view, simply calling yourself a computer company could scare away customers and investors alike. At the time, the word computer had become a liability rather than an advantage. In the summer of 1957, Digital Equipment Corporation officially opened its doors inside the old Assabet Woolen Mill, a sprawling factory complex that had been producing wool since 1847. Ken Olsen was just 31 years old, while Harlan Anderson was 27. For the company's first 3 years, they didn't build computers at all. Instead, they focused on designing and selling electronic logic modules, testing equipment that provided the steady income needed to keep the young business alive. In 1960, DEC introduced its first computer, the PDP-1, designed by engineer Ben Gurley. The initials PDP stood for Program Data Processor, a deliberate choice that continued the company's effort to avoid using the word computer. Priced at around $120,000, the PDP-1 cost only about one-fifth as much as comparable IBM systems. Roughly 50 units were produced, each equipped with a cathode ray display and a keyboard. Instead of submitting punch cards and waiting for results, users could sit directly at the machine, type commands, and see the computer respond almost instantly. The PDP-1's most enduring legacy wasn't part of DEC's original vision. In 1962, MIT programmer Steve Russell, working with a group of fellow hackers, spent roughly 200 hours creating Space War, a two-player space combat game that ran on the PDP-1. The game quickly spread to nearly every PDP-1 installed across the country, becoming a favorite wherever the machine was used. Before long, DEC was including Space War with new PDP-1 systems. A company founded to build serious computing tools for scientists had, almost by accident, helped launch the world's first video game. Ken Olsen led DEC in a way that defied the conventional wisdom taught in business schools, but it earned him deep respect from the company's engineers. Even after becoming wealthy, he chose not to buy a lavish home and continued driving a Ford, preferring a modest lifestyle over displays of success. Within DEC, individual product teams competed with one another for funding and resources. The approach fueled innovation and encouraged bold ideas, but over time it also created intense internal rivalries that would eventually become a serious problem. Around the company, almost everyone simply called him Ken. DEC's culture wasn't without its rough edges. In 1966, co-founder Harlan Anderson left the company after a falling out with Ken Olsen. As executive vice president, Anderson had helped build DEC from the very beginning, but the disagreement brought their partnership to an end. Olsen carried on as if nothing had happened, offering little public comment about Anderson's departure. The machine that truly powered DEC's rise was the PDP-8, introduced on March 22, 1965, with a price tag of just $18,000. At a time when IBM mainframes often cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, the PDP-8 offered something radically different. It became the world's first commercially successful minicomputer, eventually selling more than 50,000 units. The system's chief designer was a young engineer named Edson DeCastro. Just a year later, DEC released the PDP-8/S, becoming the first computer to sell for less than $10,000. PDP-8 systems found homes everywhere, from nuclear research laboratories and newspaper publishing rooms to factory floors and university classrooms. More importantly, they proved that a computer no longer had to be locked away in a centralized data center. It could be affordable enough for an individual department to own and use every day. Then Edson DeCastro proposed a new 16-bit machine known as the PDP-X. Ken Olsen rejected the project, believing it offered too little improvement over DEC's existing 12-bit systems. DeCastro saw things differently. In 1968, at just 29 years old, he left DEC, taking several talented engineers with him to start a new company called Data General. Their first computer, the 16-bit Nova, was less expensive than DEC's machines and quickly outsold the PDP-8. DEC responded by filing a trade secrets lawsuit, but the case ultimately went nowhere. The engineer who had created DEC's most successful computer left to build its next great competitor after his ideas were dismissed by the company's founder. It was the first clear sign of a pattern that would shape DEC's future, and it wouldn't be the last. The person who helped put DEC back on course was Gordon Bell. He joined the company in 1960 as employee number 80 after being recruited from MIT. During his first years at DEC, Bell designed the first UART, a piece of hardware that would eventually become a standard component in countless devices with serial ports, and also played a key role in developing the architectures behind the PDP-4 and PDP-6. In 1966, Bell left DEC to join Carnegie Mellon University, but when he returned in 1972 as Vice President of Engineering, he found a very different company. DEC was beginning to lose its edge, while Data General's 16-bit Nova was steadily capturing market share and exposing the weaknesses in DEC's product lineup. To answer the growing competition, Gordon Bell led an accelerated effort to develop a new computer, the PDP-11. The project was designed primarily by Harold McFarland, who came from Carnegie Mellon alongside Bell and Roger Cady, bringing valuable research and fresh ideas with him. Even then, the project nearly ended before it began. When the design was presented, DEC's management came close to canceling it. Instead, the PDP-11 reached the market in 1970 with a starting price of about $20,000. It went on to become one of the most successful mini-computers ever built, selling roughly 600,000 units. The PDP-11's influence reached far beyond DEC itself. Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie developed Unix on the machine, and Ritchie created the C programming language using it. Nearly every modern operating system can trace part of its heritage back to the computer that almost never made it into production. Even as the PDP-11 was succeeding, Gordon Bell was already planning its successor. On April 1, 1975, he gathered a team of 6 engineers on the 3rd floor of Building 12 at the Maynard Mill. Bill Strecker was appointed the project's chief architect, and together they set out to create a 32-bit evolution of the PDP-11. The new system was named VAX, short for Virtual Address Extension, a title that reflected its expanded memory architecture and far greater capabilities. DEC had built its reputation on a simple belief: smaller, less expensive, interactive computers could outperform the traditional mainframe model. The PDP-8 demonstrated that idea. The PDP-11 confirmed it, and the VAX would take it even further, helping reshape the industry and costing IBM billions in lost business. Yet hidden within that philosophy was a contradiction that few people in Maynard were willing to confront. If every new generation of computing favored machines that were smaller and more affordable, what would happen when something even smaller than a mini-computer came along? Before the arrival of the mini-computer, computing belonged almost entirely to IBM's massive room-sized systems. Companies relied on batch processing, stacks of punch cards, and machines that required entire facilities to operate. A single IBM System/360 could cost more than the average suburban home. The PDP-8 changed that equation. It delivered comparable access to computing at 1/5 the price and was small enough to sit on a workbench. Suddenly, a research laboratory, newspaper office, or university department could have a computer of its own. Cold War defense spending pushed this transformation even faster. DEC systems began appearing wherever real-time data processing mattered, places where waiting hours for results was no longer acceptable. But as DEC was building its mini-computer empire, a new revolution was quietly developing underneath it. Intel's 4004 arrived in 1971. The Altair 8800 followed in 1975. Then came the Apple II in 1977 and the IBM PC in 1981. Each generation pushed computing further, smaller, less expensive, and closer to the individual user. The same argument DEC had used to challenge the mainframe was now being used against DEC itself. The Yates mini-computer was facing the exact disruption it had once created. In 1977, the same year DEC introduced the VAX, Ken Olsen spoke 7 words that would follow him for the rest of his life. There is no reason for any individual to have a computer in his home. Olson later clarified, and the historical record supports his explanation, that he was talking about household computers controlling appliances and home systems, not the emerging personal computer movement. But the quote escaped its original meaning and became permanently attached to his legacy. The truth is more complicated. History has room for both realities: a visionary leader whose words were misunderstood, and a founder whose judgment about the next major shift in computing arrived too late. DEC did make an attempt at entering the personal computer market. The Rainbow 100 was released in 1982, but it arrived with one major problem. It was not compatible with the growing IBM PC standard. The machine failed to gain traction, but at the time, it hardly seemed important. DEC's real future appeared to be elsewhere. The VAX was about to turn the company into something far larger than anyone working inside the Maynard mill could have imagined. The VAX 11/780 was unveiled on October 25, 1977, and the first systems began shipping the following year. Carnegie Mellon University received the very first machine, a 32-bit Super Mini computer designed to challenge IBM mainframes while costing only a fraction of the price. Bill Strecker's architecture provided the performance, while Dave Cutler's VMS operating system gave the system the stability and reliability businesses demanded. Together, they created a machine powerful enough to redefine what a smaller computer could achieve. The scale of DEC's success was impossible to ignore. Annual revenue surged from around $700 million to more than $14 billion. Hundreds of thousands of VAX systems were shipped to customers around the world. In 1986, while much of the computer industry struggled, DEC's profits increased by 38%. The company expanded to more than 120,000 employees across 80 countries, and its market value reached a peak of roughly $24 billion. DEC became Massachusetts' second-largest employer, surpassed only by the state government itself. The old mill complex where the company began had transformed along with it. Purchased for $2.2 million in 1974, the site eventually expanded to more than 1 million square feet, a symbol of how far the company had risen from its humble beginnings. The PDP-8 showed that computers no longer had to be locked away in massive mainframe rooms. The PDP-11 demonstrated that smaller systems could transform the way software was created and used. The VAX proved that DEC could challenge IBM on its own ground and succeed. 3 machines, 3 revolutions, 1 old mill beside 1 river, but within those same walls where DEC built its empire, the first signs of its downfall had already begun to take root. Dave Cutler, the creator of VMS, was already working on DEC's next chapter. He was developing a new RISC-based processor called Prism, along with a new operating system known as Mica. But inside the company, engineers were divided. Many believed Unix and the rising power of microprocessors represented the future of computing. The Operations Committee, focused on protecting the enormous profits generated by the VAX business, refused to shift direction. The very argument DEC had once used to defeat the mainframe was now being used against DEC itself. The company that built its empire by embracing disruption failed to recognize that same disruption when it arrived at its own door. In 1988, DEC canceled the Prism project. On paper, the decision seemed logical. The company could protect its VAX business, license MIPS processors for workstations, and avoid the enormous cost of developing a completely new architecture. The existing business was still generating strong profits. The new one required a massive investment. Dave Cutler was furious. That summer, Nathan Myhrvold of Microsoft helped arrange a meeting between Cutler and Bill Gates. On October 31, 1988, Cutler officially joined Microsoft. Many members of his DEC West team followed him, submitting their resignations on a Friday and walking into Microsoft offices the following Monday. They spent the next 6 months creating the blueprint for an entirely new operating system. That original specification would eventually be preserved in the Smithsonian. The result was Windows NT, a system heavily influenced by the Mica operating system Dave Cutler had designed for DEC's canceled Prism project. DEC responded with a lawsuit, and the settlement included royalty payments, along with an agreement to bring NT to DEC's Alpha processor. But the consequences could not be undone. The technology DEC had abandoned had become the foundation of Microsoft's future. The personal computer continued gaining power at a pace DEC could not match. Sun Microsystems moved aggressively into DEC's workstation territory with Unix-based systems, while the VAX 9000, DEC's attempt to directly challenge IBM's mainframes, became an expensive disappointment. In 1991, DEC reported its first full-year loss in company history. A year later, the man who had built the company was pushed out. Ken Olsen resigned as CEO in 1992 at the age of 66. He never returned. Robert Palmer took control of DEC, but his mission was no longer expansion. It was survival. Between 1990 and 1998, the company eliminated roughly 70,000 positions. The restructuring cost DEC approximately $4.8 billion. The company Ken Olsen had built around loyalty, innovation, and a family-like culture was transformed into an organization defined by layoffs, cost-cutting, and the number of jobs removed each quarter. There was one final glimpse of the innovation that had once defined DEC. In 1995, researchers at DEC's Palo Alto laboratory, led by computer scientist Louis Meunier, created a search engine to showcase the power of the Alpha processor. They called it Alta Vista. When it launched on December 15th, it handled 300,000 search requests on its first day. By 1997, that number had grown to 80 million queries per day. Alta Vista became the world's first full-text searchable index of the Internet, a modern search engine created inside a struggling company, running on the very hardware DEC had built. But DEC had no plan for what it had created. The Alpha processor, a direct descendant of the canceled Prism project, became one of the fastest chips in the world throughout the 1990s. But DEC faced a brutal reality. It could not compete as a semiconductor manufacturer against Intel's enormous scale and resources. In May 1997, DEC filed a patent infringement lawsuit against Intel. The eventual settlement forced DEC to give up its chip fabrication facilities. The company was no longer just cutting costs. It was selling away the pieces that made it unique. On January 26, 1998, Compaq announced that it would acquire DEC for $9.6 billion. By then, DEC had been reduced to just 53,500 employees, a dramatic fall from the more than 120,000 people who once powered the company. A business that had reached a market value of $24 billion was sold for less than half of that peak. Compaq struggled to absorb the company it had purchased. 4 years later, in 2002, Hewlett-Packard acquired Compaq in a $25 billion deal. DEC's technology, once revolutionary, was now buried beneath layers of corporate ownership. The name vanished. Ken Olsen passed away on February 6, 2011, at the age of 84, while receiving hospice care in Indianapolis. His family did not disclose the cause of death. Gordon Bell died on May 17, 2024, at 89. Edson DeCastro followed on September 6, 2024, at the age of 85. The people who created and shaped DEC are gone, but the machines they built remain. PDP-11 systems continue operating in industrial and military environments decades after production ended. Collectors spend thousands of dollars restoring and preserving working PDP-8 machines. The SIMH emulator project keeps DEC's classic operating systems alive by allowing them to run on modern hardware, while enthusiasts around the world continue creating new software for platforms that were considered obsolete long before they discovered them. OpenVMS, the direct successor to Dave Cutler's original VMS, is still commercially supported on current processors. The operating system DEC created for the VAX in the 1970s is not just history. Somewhere in the world, it is still running right now. The legacy continued far beyond DEC. Dave Cutler brought the ideas behind VMS with him to Microsoft, where they became the foundation for Windows NT and every major version of Windows that followed. His work did not stop there. Cutler later helped create the operating system architecture behind Azure and the hypervisor that powered the Xbox One. The engineering principles developed inside the Maynard Mill decades earlier now form part of the technology running a significant share of the world's cloud infrastructure. Alta Vista demonstrated that the entire internet could be indexed and searched in seconds. In 1997, Larry Page and Sergey Brin brought their PageRank technology to DEC, offering a glimpse of where online search was heading. DEC chose not to pursue it. The future had already arrived at their doorstep twice, and both times no one opened the door. DEC created the mini-computer revolution. DEC engineers helped create the foundation of the modern search engine. They built operating system architectures that would influence the software running across the world. Their designers developed a processor that for a time was the fastest on the planet. The talent was there, the technology was there, but DEC could never let go of protecting the business it already controlled long enough to become the company its own engineers were trying to create. The old wool mill beside the Assabet River in Maynard is still standing. Its clock tower, built in 1892 by Lorenzo Maynard, continues to mark the hours, wound by hand once a week with 90 turns of the crank and a climb of 120 steps. Today, the building is known as Mill and Main. Small businesses now occupy the same floors where DEC engineers once designed the machines that challenged IBM's dominance. Drive past the building on an ordinary weekday afternoon, and there is little to reveal the history that unfolded inside. No signs, no monuments. Only the size of the place and the quiet hint at what it once was. What DEC left behind cannot be counted only in processors, code, and machines. Its greatest legacy was a different way of thinking about technology and about the relationship between people and the tools they use. Before DEC, computing was controlled by a small group of specialists. Users handed their problems to the operators who managed the machines, then waited for the results to come back. Ken Olson's belief that the person doing the work should directly interact with the computer was more than a business decision. It was a belief that technology should serve people, not separate them from the machines they depended on. Every interactive system that followed, every cursor flashing on every display, carries a piece of that idea. Whether the people building those systems know the name of the person who imagined it first or not. DEC's legacy also lived on through the people who left it. When the company eliminated roughly 70,000 positions over a decade, those engineers did not vanish. They spread throughout Route 128, Silicon Valley, and the broader technology industry, carrying with them a culture of problem-solving and engineering discipline that could not be copied from a textbook. DEC alumni went on to help build companies across the technology world. Bob Supnick, who led the VAX 8800 project, later created the SIMH emulator, keeping DEC's historic systems alive in software. Engineers from DEC's networking divisions took their experience into companies like Cisco, Juniper, and a new generation of internet infrastructure firms, helping shape the connected world that followed. DEC's impact on networking deserves a story of its own. At its Western Research Laboratory in Palo Alto, the company helped advance Ethernet alongside Xerox and Intel, contributing to the standard that would eventually connect offices around the world. In 1984, DEC introduced VAX clusters, allowing multiple computers to share storage and automatically take over when another system failed. The design anticipated many of the ideas that would later define cloud computing, nearly 2 decades before the cloud became mainstream. When modern engineers discuss high availability and fault tolerance today, they are often solving problems DEC had already tackled during the 1980s. Then there was the culture, the part of DEC's legacy that is hardest to measure and the one former employees often miss the most. People who worked there describe an environment that feels almost impossible by today's standards. Engineers were given remarkable freedom. If someone had an idea and could convince a few coworkers it was worth pursuing, they could build a prototype without navigating layers of approval and paperwork. Decisions were made by engineers who understood the technology because the person leading the company understood the technology too. That culture created machines built with extraordinary care, not because a spreadsheet demanded it, but because the people designing them were allowed to focus on making the best machine they could. But that same culture created its own problems. The product structure that encouraged innovation in the 1960s gradually became an internal battlefield by the 1980s. Teams developing competing systems fought for resources, avoided collaboration, and often refused to share technology with one another. Customers sometimes received conflicting advice from different DEC sales groups representing the same company. Olson believed competition within the organization pushed people to perform at their best. And, for a while, it did. But eventually, the rivalry became so intense that DEC was competing more with itself than with the outside world. The company lost the ability to agree on what it should build, or even who it was building for. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. DEC was founded on the belief that the giants of computing were too attached to their existing businesses to recognize the next revolution. IBM could not see why anyone would want a computer that cost $18,000 instead of $2 million. Years later, DEC made the same mistake in reverse. It could not see why anyone would want a computer that cost $2,000 instead of $18,000. The pattern appears across industries, but technology seems to repeat it more than anywhere else. The company that learns to see around the first corner rarely recognizes what is waiting around the second. What remains in the end is the work. Not the stock price, not the layoffs, not the acquisition headlines that followed DEC through its long decline. The work. Code still running on machines their creators never expected to outlive them. Architecture still influencing the systems that operate hospitals, banks, and power networks. A philosophy of design that treated the user as an active participant rather than someone waiting for permission to access the machine. That was DEC's original argument, born inside an old wool mill beside a river in Massachusetts. And nearly 5 decades after the company name disappeared, that idea is still alive. The company that proved smaller machines could defeat larger ones could not accept the possibility that something even smaller would eventually defeat theirs. If you worked at DEC, wrote programs on a PDP, managed a VAX system, or used AltaVista before Google took over search, leave a comment below. Tell us the machine, the year, and whether it is still running today. The engineers who built these systems and the people who depended on them understand something that the companies that acquired them often missed. History is not just about what was sold, it is about what was created. Subscribe and become part of the archive, because the story of American technology is filled with companies that transformed the world and then faded away. And we are only getting started. The story of another American technology empire is coming next.